Let me ask you first of all, what you make of the latest moves. We've had these referendums, lots of reports of people being forced at gunpoint to sign their polling papers. And now that we're hearing that the leaders in these areas of Ukraine that are occupied by the Russians are apparently formally asking to join Russia.
Well, this was, of course, all pre-organized, and you're quite right. It's really not a referendum. If somebody comes to your house with a ballot and two people accompanying that person have automatic rifles with them and ask you to say yes or no, you're probably going to say yes. The point, I think, for Putin is to say, all right, you've asked for us to annex your territories to become part of Russia. There will then be a formal announcement that they've been annexed. And then Putin can say, this territory now belongs to Mother Russia. This is Russian territory. And so if President Zelensky's rather successful counteroffensive in the Kherson region, and that's one of the regions that has allegedly voted to join Russia, if that continues and there are attacks in that region, Putin can then say, you have attacked Russia directly with American weapons, and he could, if he wants to, use that as an excuse to escalate, either by destroying more Ukrainian infrastructure or some fear, because he's threatened the use of nuclear weapons and has said, I am not bluffing.
Yeah, and I'll come to that nuclear threat in just a moment. But this is the sort of technique that we've seen Putin use in the past, haven't we? In Crimea, these supposed referendums, which have been widely denounced as a sham. And as you were saying there, people being forced at gunpoint to sign these polling papers and then using them as a pretext to try and actually claim this territory as Russia's.
Yes, we have. And the interesting thing is, Crimea was the first case of this. With an alleged also, 90 whatever percent turnout. But the interesting thing is that the Ukrainians have in fact succeeded a few weeks ago in hitting Crimea, in hitting targets in Crimea, airfields and things like that. And even though that is by, according to Russian definitions, part of Russia, there wasn't any particular retaliation against that. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be different this time.
Yeah, and what will be the reaction of the international community, do you think, if, as people seem to expect, President Putin, perhaps in a big address to Parliament that he's due to make on Friday, actually formally announces that this is now Russian territory?
Well, all of the major countries in the West certainly are going to denounce this. They already have before the referendum. But if you look at even the Crimean case, very, very few countries have recognized Crimea as being part of Russia. Belarus has, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, I think North Korea. But the vast majority of countries in the world, even if they haven't criticized Russia's attack on Ukraine, many countries have territorial disputes. And the idea that one country can just march into your territory, conquer bits of it, and say it now belongs to them is something that, the vast majority of countries aren't going to accept.
You mentioned a moment ago that threat from President Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons and his very explicit words saying this is not a bluff. What did you make of that? Do you think that he could seriously contemplate such a move?
Well, if you go back and look at Russian military doctrine in the past few years, certainly since Crimea in 2014, they do discuss the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, in what is a conventional war. But clearly, were he to do this, this is breaking a taboo that's existed since 1945. Which is the last time the nuclear weapons were used. And so it would be a huge step, and the U.S. has certainly been explicit to the global public in saying that it has been warning Russia for some time that if it were to contemplate something like that and to do it, there would be very, very severe consequences. Of course, they're not explicit about what those consequences will be, but there would be military consequences. He's doing this clearly to intimidate the Ukrainians, first of all, and that they won't continue with their counteroffensive, but he's not going to succeed in that. But he's also doing it because, there are publics all around the world, in the West and other countries, who say, well, we really have to put pressure on the Ukrainians to sit down and negotiate now with Russia just to make sure that Putin doesn't do this. We're not sure what that negotiation would be, and we're not sure that Putin wants to negotiate, and Zelensky doesn't want to negotiate now because, Ukraine would lose far too much. So, but I think those are all of the reasons why he's threatening this. If he actually did it, it would be unprecedented. We don't know even we know that if you're talking about strategic nuclear weapons, which of course can reach the United States, there is a process and a chain of command, and different people have to sign off on it and everything. As far as we know, there is no such process for these tactical nuclear weapons. And by the way, the radioactive fallout from such a weapon would affect not only Ukraine, but all the neighboring countries, including Russia.
Yeah, do you think all of this is actually just Putin gearing up to say that he is ready to start serious negotiations, perhaps with Russia controlling things like those areas where we've had the referendums, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and so on?
It could be, but we also have to remember that Russia doesn't actually fully control any of the regions where they've had these so-called referenda. But yeah, it could be a prelude to him saying, I've won. These areas are now part of Russia. Let's sit down and negotiate something. It's possible. Nobody can read his mind. It's obviously very opaque. And there are some people who seriously believe that he might go the other way and escalate and use some kind of a weapon of mass destruction.
Let me ask you about this other issue, which is the leaks from these two Nord Stream gas pipelines. We've had a British defence source telling the Times that they think that it was Russian sabotage using an explosive device dropped into the sea, which caused leaks from these two gas pipelines, which have led to a stream of gas pouring into the ocean at a time that we're facing an energy crisis.
So everyone I've spoken to who is an expert on pipelines believes that this was done by the Russians. This obviously was not a natural accident occurring at three different pipelines. And of course, the Russians laid the pipelines, so they know exactly how to do this. And so the point is, first of all, is, environmental destruction, methane gas. And of course, the Europeans are going to have to clean this up. The Russians aren't going to clean it up. Also, I think natural gas prices will go up again because this takes away potential energy supplies. So I think it's also, again, to sort of intimidate the Europeans and warn them that, they could get very cold in the winter, and have them hopefully tell their governments that they should rethink sanctions on Russia and should be willing to deal with Russia. That's one possible explanation for it, both to really intimidate people and shock them, but also to get them to want to sit down with Russia.
To send a signal. So the motivation would be to sort of send a signal that, look, we can cause further disruption to your energy supplies, as if we didn't know that already.
Right. This is the Russian playbook, disruption, and sort of acting as a spoiler. That's what they do, and they're pretty good at doing it. And as you say, everyone in Europe knows that they can do this already, so maybe it was just an extra signal.
And you mentioned sanctions there. We've had the European Union announcing a new round of proposed sanctions, including a cap on the price of Russian oil, further curbs on tech in high tech, on trade in high tech goods and so on. Those will presumably simply add to the economic pain and isolation which Russia is facing.
Well, they certainly will, and these are sanctions that are very similar to ones that the U.S. has recently introduced. But presumably they will also impact, as the sanctions are already, they will impact European countries too, in terms of high energy prices, inflation, and things like that. So, and shortages of energy, and they don't, seem to have deterred Russia yet.
Yeah, I mean, is there any sign that these sanctions are working?
There is, they are having an economic impact in Russia, not as great as people or as quickly as people had thought, but they are having an economic impact, and it's going to be worse next year because Russians are already, they can't manufacture certain high-end automobiles at them anymore because they don't have the components for them, and it's going to get worse next year. Factories are going to have to close down because the Russians won't have components for manufacturing a variety of things. But it's the impact is working more slowly. So the economic impact is there, and I think it will get worse. But it hasn't had much of an impact on his political calculations, and one can only wonder whether this very badly organized so-called partial mobilization of Russians, which has now really angered people, particularly in the cities, and caused a lot of resistance. I think 200,000 Russians have left since they announced this, which is about a week ago. One just wonders that may have more of an impact in the end on what happens in the war than the sanctions.
And is there any sign that this opposition that we've seen, more protests on the streets, despite the very heavy penalties for anyone who does raise their voice in dissent, as well as you're saying, thousands of people fleeing the country, is any of that going to lead to any moves against President Putin?
It's interesting that the heads of both of their houses of parliament, the Duma and the Federation Council, have very strongly criticized the mobilization process. They haven't named Putin by name, but they've criticized what's happening there. And then you've also had local leaders, including the very brutal ruler of Chechnya, who is a Putin ally, but you've had local leaders throughout Russia criticize the way that this mobilization is being done. So there is certainly more overt and public criticism of this, even if it isn't, tied directly to Putin. And I would have thought that may increase as time goes on because, as they try and recruit more of these people, many of whom have no military experience and have no training and don't want to be cannon fodder.